Are you aware the model for the first world government was conceived by darkness in the Tower of Babel? The very first initiative they took in their mission was in direct defiance to the instructions given to man found in Genesis 1 and 9, which were identical commands from God for both before and after the flood. The strategy employed by the Lord to countermove Satan's objectives with the creation of multiple languages remains an enormous deterrent some 4,000 years later. Join us now as we unravel the table of nations as it joins the mission of Yahweh, which will ultimately checkmate the agenda of the soon coming one world government. I am Mark Russak, and you are listening to The Russak Outlook. As always, just my opinion. Good day, everyone. Hi, this is Mark Russak. You're listening to The Russak Outlook. As always, I'd like to thank you for joining. Today, we're going to be talking about the Tower of Babel and what I believe is the ultimate globalist agenda, which will be to remove God. And when I say the globalist, I'm talking about what will ultimately be a one world government. And, for those who may or may not believe it, this is what the Bible has laid out that will be in the end times. And I think the signs are overwhelmingly pointing in that direction. And I wanted to look at the Tower of Babel because I believe so much of the foundations of what we see in terms of getting away or moving away from God can be seen or can be found or traced back to the book of Genesis in chapter 11, which is about the Tower of Babel. It's a very short chapter, but it's pretty rich and it speaks volumes. And we're going to be unpacking a lot of it there, including a lot of the history and some of the culture back then, and ultimately how we can see those things today that are incorporated, including God's reaction to the Tower of Babel that we'll see plays a monumental piece in deterring or slowing down or degrading the move towards a one world government. I'd just like to ask you, if you don't mind, if you could hit the like or subscribe button, and the like and subscribe button, and ring that bell if you're on the various platforms. I know YouTube has that. It really helps us get the information out. And why subscribe? We're just trying to alert you when new topics come out, and hopefully we're presenting information that you find relevant, because as always, we're trying to get to the truth. And in doing so, we look at things from different angles, not only in the Word of God, but we're looking at historical evidence and archaeological evidence. And, we're in this particular topic, we're going to be delving down both of those roads. So, again, if you wouldn't mind, and please jump on our website, russackoutlook.com, and join our email list. I'd like to read you a quote from Paul Henry Spack, which I believe speaks volumes today. And this goes back to the 1950s. He was the first president of the European Parliament. And he said, "We do not need another committee. We have too many already. What we want is a man of sufficient stature to hold the allegiance of all people and to lift us out of this economic morass into which we are sinking. Send us such a man, and be he God or devil, we will receive him." So, right away, it speaks to the difficulty of moving different groups, different people groups, different nations, different cultures, different languages, and moving them all in the right direction, because they bring their own unique set of circumstances, problems, positive aspects. It's very, very difficult to move people in one direction when you think about all of the different cultures and the histories that are involved, and the power game that goes on, because a lot of these nations are gunning for the top. They want to be the top dog, or they want a seat at the table, or they want to be at the head of the table. No surprise there. So this is really what I wanted to investigate. I wanted to unravel, because I think not only in terms of a move towards a global government, but also in culture, we are seeing things that are so prevalent today that can be traced back literally to the book of Genesis in chapter 11. Because we're going to be covering not only this aspect of a globalist agenda, but we're also going to drill down to the individual. We're going to drill down to the person who's trying to push away from God. So this is going to be a two-part series. And interestingly enough, we're just coming off of a series on the flood and the Nephilim. And I haven't forgotten you people there. There's been a lot of comments I've received and emails, and thank you for a lot of the encouragement. We're also going to see some history about the Nephilim playing a role in this as well. So I think you're going to be a little bit surprised. There are some things that while I was studying this, I uncovered and left me thinking, whoa, I didn't see that before. So hopefully you're in that in that ballpark with me. So on that note, I'd like to move on from here and really unpack the Tower of Babel. So I'd like to begin with instructions that were given from God directly to man before the flood, after the flood, and what the response was in the Tower of Babel, which comes right after the flood. So before the flood, I'm reading Genesis 1:26 through 28, and I'm highlighting verse 28. And then God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it." So he's telling, go ahead, spread out, go ahead throughout the earth and fulfill it. This is before the fall of man. This is before the sin of Adam. We all know about the sin of Adam and the fall, and the flood, and we've covered that in the past few broadcasts. So let me bring you to God's instructions in Genesis 9, verse 1, after the flood. So God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." So the same thing, fill the earth. Go out, go out and take dominion and be fruitful, have children, and spread your wings, so to speak. So what was the response in Genesis chapter 11? I'm going to read the first four verses here with an emphasis on verse 4, because this was the ultimate response after the flood. "And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Then they said to one another, 'Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly.' They had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar." This is what I want to concentrate on here. "And they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city, and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth.'" So clearly they understood God's instructions. They were aware of it, and they're saying, let's all get together, let's build this tower, let's go to the heavens, let's ascend up on high, because we know what God wants us to do, and that's not where we want to be. Because ultimately this, I believe, is the influence of evil, because it's a war with God. Literally Satan is at war with Jesus Christ, and this is an ongoing battle that we know what the end will bring. But this was their response, and this was man's response with it. So they built this thing, and I will say, and I'm going to be covering a lot of this in the second broadcast. People kind of make fun of or don't think it's real. Let me just tell you, there's an immense amount of archaeological evidence to bear this out. We have a lot of this, but this was very sophisticated construction, and we'll be getting into that, and immensely tall. It's going to blow you away when we get to the second broadcast how big this thing actually got to, because it dwarfs the tallest buildings in the world today. So let me keep this going. So I'm going to read the whole chapter now. It's only 9 verses, and if you're watching on video, you see the title here is "Come, let us make a name for ourselves." And nothing about God, nothing about our man's reliance upon him. Let us make a name for ourselves. So I'm going to read the whole chapter 11. Now the whole earth had one language and one speech. Now, let me just preface this by saying this is coming off of the ark. These are numerous generations afterwards. I will say that there are some who believe it's all one language, and some will say that depending upon where they were, but I believe it is all one language, just as the Bible laid it out. Meaning that some theologians believe there might have been a couple of different languages, but the ones involved in this had one language. And let me continue in verse 2. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar. That plain is going to become important too, because it's going to be wide enough to lay the foundation, and they dwelt there. And let me just say, as they journeyed from the east, we know that eventually they're coming from Mount Ararat, because that's where the ark landed. And interestingly enough, the land of Shinar, if you look due east, there is where you'll find Mount Ararat in Turkey. Jumping to verse 3, then they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. So this is what I'm talking about, very sophisticated construction techniques that you'll see, and it was prevalent throughout that whole region, as these archaeological discoveries have found. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered over the face of the earth, over the face of the whole earth. Verse 5, but the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language. That is what they begin, and this is what they begin to do. Now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. So, interestingly enough, here they're trying to get to the heavens. They're trying to get to God and overtake God ultimately. But what happens? The Lord comes right down. And I believe, there's nothing that can bear this out specifically. But this is the Lord. This is part of the Trinity, and I would suggest that this was Jesus coming down to the earth and seeing this. And from here we go now to verse 7. And if you're following me on video, I've highlighted these next few words. Come, let us go down and confuse their language. So it went from singular in verse 5 to plural in verse 7. So that's where I believe you have God's counsel of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So come, let us go down, confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from over the face of the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore its name is called Babel, because the Lord confused their language over the earth. From there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. So he's given them different languages. He's basically confounded their plans, because ultimately their plan was in violation, was direct disobedience to what the Lord had instructed. And in doing so, he gave them numerous languages. And you'll see, I believe to this day, that is one of the biggest hindrances to moving forward. And we all know that, Babel is, when you use that word, you're speaking Babel. And, that's where its origin is from. So if you're following me on video, I'm showing you different images of translation. So these are people who potentially could be in the United Nations, European Union, different councils. It really doesn't matter. But they have headphones on, because whoever is speaking, there's somebody who's assigned to translate that into that person's native language and then convey that message. And this is what I'm saying today, that I believe language translation is one of the biggest hindrances to ultimately forming a one world government, because getting people from different countries, and I'll just say myself, for my vocation, I am an engineer by trade, and a lot of times I have to work with different groups or different departments, and I have to communicate to them, what we're going to be doing, and my language might be a little bit differently in speaking to them. I'm breaking it down into what I'll call layman's terms so that they can understand it, and it's important, because it doesn't matter how much information I know, it's what the people and everybody who's gathered, in order for everybody to move in one direction, we all must be speaking the same language. So that's that's difficult at times, and oftentimes you may say something in a certain language, and that translation does not necessarily carry through. So if you think about all of the different languages and translations and cultures and backgrounds and histories and egos, it's very, very, very difficult to keeping people moving in one direction. But that is ultimately what is at stake. And we will see as we go through this that is the end game of the Tower of Babel, is to basically confuse people and to kind of lull them to sleep so that they're all moving into one direction. It's a game of deception. And I believe, you see a lot of that today where the media, puts out the headlines, the politicians and the different leaders of different governments and companies and corporations are now so big that they have more power than a lot of countries. I'm coming from the United States. You've got tech companies that have a larger GDP than most, or their gross sales or their gross income is much larger than GDP of most nations. Some of the bigger tech giants that you would know from Silicon Valley and so forth. But anyway, what I'm getting at is there's power in government, there's power in corporations, there's power in business, the banking industries, but there's still that challenge of getting everybody moving in the same direction, and language is a big hindrance to it. And I believe that this is my own personal opinion that, obviously God knew what he was doing when he said, we'll give them different languages. So I wanted to just point to you, give you a little bit of a topographical outline or geographical outline for where the land of Shinar is. Excuse me. In the top left, I give you Mount Ararat, where the ark would have been eventually landed. And if you look to the right of that, it's Babylon, Babel, and you see the cone of light coming down, and then they would be scattered eventually, and they would go into those different directions. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of an idea from a map's perspective. This ultimately, what we're talking about is the land of Mesopotamia, what's called the Fertile Crescent. And so I've given you some images below and just where that is. And this is mainly what we're talking about is modern day Iraq, specifically when we're talking about the Tower of Babel and Babylon and Babylonia and in that area, the Babylonian Empire. But then, that obviously spread out to other areas as well. So you see that from going into Syria and Lebanon and Israel and Egypt, and just below the Fertile Crescent is the land of Saudi Arabia and Jordan. So I like to give you kind of an idea what we're talking about, what we're reading from Scripture, where physically this was. And then, a side note, I would say, if you're looking on the lower right, the land of Ur, which is just below where you see Sumer, that is where Abraham would eventually get his marching orders to go from there. And so what we're talking about is just before the call to Abraham. So this is before Abraham, but Abraham's life is, or birth and his mission and his calling is right around the corner right after this. So I like to say that Genesis 10 is known as the Table of Nations, and I say, who needs Ancestry.com when we have the Table of Nations? And by that I mean, ultimately, if you believe the Bible, we are all descendants of Noah and ultimately leading up to Adam. And at some point in a future broadcast, I'm going to show you the unquestionable, undeniable population numbers, how that breaks down, and that we can actually be traced back that far. But what we'll see in the Table of Nations, and I'll break this down in the next slide, you'll see a graph, which breaks it into the three sons of Noah, because as we know, Noah's sons were on the ark, and they are Japheth, Shem, and Ham. And if you look on this map, I'm giving you kind of a topographical or landscape. And if you're not following it, if you're one of our podcast listeners, the land of Shem would be a lot of what we've been covering here, and that ultimately is under the blessing in Israel and the surrounding areas of the Persian Gulf, north of the Persian Gulf, into Iraq, into parts of Iran, and then right above that, heading towards Europe, would be Japheth, and then your origins could be traced there. So as myself, a North American, if I'm going to believe this, and I do, then my origins would be coming from Japheth. And then if you're talking about Northern Africa and that continent, that is Ham, and that's where a lot of your origin will be coming from. And that's where we're going to be breaking this down. We're ultimately going to be talking about the lineage that leads from Ham, is who is responsible for the Tower of Babel, and ultimately what is I was going to say a gentleman. I don't know that he was a gentleman, but he was a man. I believe he was a man. He was clearly heavily influenced by Satan, and his name was Nimrod. And we're going to really do a deep dive on who he was and what he did in the next follow-up. But what I wanted to look at here is chapter 10 gives you the complete breakdown, and I'm not going to read it all. But if you are following me on video, I wanted to highlight where it says, verse 8, Cush begot Nimrod. And then if you jump down to verse 10, it says, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. So he started with Babel. He was the originator. He was the one in the forefront for beginning and building the Tower of Babel. And it's important that I highlight all of what is said about him, because if you look at the Table of Nations and all the different names that are broken down, there's far more emphasis that is put on Nimrod than anywhere else. So I wanted to point that out from the beginning. So Cush begot Nimrod, and we'll break down exactly the meaning of the description that the Lord gives us there. And again, we're going to be covering Nimrod's life in the next broadcast. But he is ultimately the leader of this, and he comes from the lineage of Ham. And at the beginning, his kingdom was Babel, and then we're going to be covering all of the other areas that he built up in the land of Shinar. So I'm laying out for you here the Table of Nations, Genesis 10. And what I'd like to point out here is in the middle, you have Shem, Ham, and Japheth. They are the three sons. And Ham begat Canaan. And Canaan, if you look at, and I'm pointing an arrow to it, Genesis 9:18, Ham was the father of Canaan. And it's very important here because this whole lineage, according to Scripture, has been cursed. And we know that the land of Canaan was the land of the Nephilim. It was the land of giants. There were many, numerous tribes that are described there. But Canaan being a principal one, the Canaanites. You can go throughout many different scriptures. I'm going to cite one here before we close that I believe is very important. But at any rate, I wanted to point out that Ham begat Canaan, and Nimrod, as you see, is in that lineage under Ham. He actually falls directly under Cush, which we would know as modern-day Libya in that area. But that is, you'll see in a second that there was a specific curse that was put on that I wanted to touch on. But Ham, the father of Canaan, 9:18, and we also see it in the breakdown of the Table of Nations. And just basically, Ham was the one who was cursed. Shem is where you'll find the lineage of Abraham and the Hebrews. And then Japheth, again, moving towards Europe and beyond. I would say North America and South America would be covered in under Japheth as well. So just the beginning of chapter 10, these are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Sons were born to them after the flood. So all of these sons and grandsons and great-grandchildren that we're talking about here is all after the flood. It's been made clear here. So this is really what I wanted to center on in terms of the relationship to the Nephilim. I'd like to go back to Genesis chapter 6, and again, past two broadcasts we covered this. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them. The sons of God, who were the fallen angels in line with Lucifer, saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any that they chose. Jumping down to verse 4. The Nephilim were the offspring, were on the earth in those days and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man and bore children to them. So again, these past 3 broadcasts, actually, we've covered all of this, seeing the abundance of evidence throughout the earth today that you can see of these giants and these Nephilim. And we know that they were before the flood, and then we also covered the numerous examples after the flood. But I wanted to point out that the result of the Nephilim is sexual sin. It's a mutation of a fallen angel coming down and having sexual relations with a human woman. Interestingly enough, if I go back to Ham, or if I switch over to Ham, in Genesis 9:18 through 28, let me pick it up from verse 20. Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brothers outside. Goes on to say, then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backward, covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces turned backwards, and they did not see their father's nakedness. So there's not a lot of detail there, but it's clearly tied to something, what I believe is sexual. Why would they point out that he was naked? What's the significance there? And then it says in verse 24, when Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall be to his brothers. And he also said, blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. So there you see the breakdown of the 3. And you can look at that Shem is clearly, he's receiving the blessing. Japheth is receiving the blessing. But cursing is going to Canaan. And why? And so, what is it? So what I'm trying to point out here is we're going to see that Canaan was a land filled, or tribes filled with Nephilim giants, where clearly Satan's legions were moving and advancing in that land in preparation, I believe, for Abraham, eventually coming in. And we covered why, when Abraham came on the scene, how he traveled through this land and it was filled with giants. And then we see that afterwards with Moses and Joshua and even David and others. So I'm suggesting that there may be some relationship here. I don't know this, but I just found it that it kind of jumps out. So I believe that the tie-in to the Nephilim giants could be tied to some type of sexual sin here. It's not really clear. Does it mean that Canaan violated? Does it mean that Ham or there's some kind of violation there? I'm going to suggest. It's not real clear. I haven't seen anything definitive from any of the commentary of the theologians that I've looked into, but I believe that there's something more here. And and if somebody's got a comment, or they know some additional information, I'd love to hear it. And if I learn some more down the road, I'll pass it along. So let me just close with some things about the Canaanites and kind of the flip side of some things that you'll see today. So I'm going to read Deuteronomy 7:1 verses 5 first. When the Lord your God brings you into the land which you go to possess, and he casts out many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. So we've covered all of this. We know through all their meanings and their history. These are all lines of Nephilim giants. These are all tribes of giants, of the result of Satan's fallen angels having intercourse with women, and these were their offspring. So this is what the Lord's instructions to them. You shall conquer them and utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them, show no mercy. You shall make no marriages. You will not give your daughter to their son, nor take their daughter for their son. They will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods. So the anger of the Lord will be aroused against you and destroy you suddenly. Thus you shall deal with them. You shall destroy their altars, break down their sacred pillars, cut down their wooden images, and burn their carved images with fire. So we see throughout that these are people that worshiped to the god of Baal, to other false gods. They had altars built to them. They sacrificed humans to them. And so, I'm giving you some examples and some highlights of a statue that was found. And I also pointed out in Numbers, and we've covered this before, if you look up that where Moses sends the spies to look into the land of Canaan, and they come back and they say, we are grasshoppers in their sight. They're intimidated, except for the two. And they have to they're carrying fruit back, and it took them a cluster of grapes was so heavy and so big that they had to carry it on a pole between two men. Some analysis there that people believe that meant it would weigh somewhere between 100 and 150 pounds. That's how big. And so I give you also an image of a grasshopper on the size of somebody's hand. That's how they said they viewed themselves when looking at these giants in the land of Canaan, and that they would view them the same way. So I wanted to flip the script. Richard Dawkins, who's a pretty avowed, well, he isn't avowed, atheist, but pretty famous or popular in some circles. And I wanted to read a quote from him, and a lot of this, my understanding is it comes from these readings of the Old Testament about how God dealt with these Nephilim giants, these purveyors of evil. And his quote is this. It says, "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully." And so what I wanted to point out here is it's so important when we're talking to different people. And if your perspective is that you don't believe in God, and you read this and you're going, well, wait a minute, why is God telling them to utterly destroy them, to kill them, to destroy every man, woman, and child in their tribes? But if you understand where this came from and what they were all about, then you get it. Because I'll be honest with you, for a long time, when I was reading the Bible and I would read these passages and I say, this isn't like God. This isn't the God of love that I know and understand. But when you get the perspective of who these people were, these were tribes of evil, tribes of the devil trying to infiltrate the plan of God and obstruct the plan of God. And ultimately, this was about stopping the blood lineage leading up to the Messiah, leading up to Jesus. So when you understand that, then you go, okay, yeah, I get it. This is evil personified. That's what you need to do. But if you don't understand it and you're just reading it at face value, then you don't get it. So it's very important to understand the perspective of somebody that you may be talking to, what their interpretation is. And I always say, well, if you're talking to somebody who's a skeptic or a non-believer, or if that's you and you're listening, what do you believe in is probably a good basis or a good foundation to have that conversation. In other words, do you believe that, that nothing came from nothing and we're all here by accident, we're all examples or the result of some type of evolution? Then that's fine. Then, that's where you go from. Or do you say, I recognize that if you look at the majesty of this world and creation and everything around you, then God or somebody or something had to have a hand in the design of it, which is what you would get your intelligent design scientists saying. But it's important to know what that perspective is. And that's where I would begin if I'm having that conversation, or if you have a question, you can shoot me an email. And then that's really the basis, I think, to go from, because it's always best to handle it that way. Or you may say, hey, I've believed in the Bible, or I'm a Muslim, or I'm a Hindu, or whatever the perspective is. That's where you need to start from, not something blank out in the open. That's the way you're going to be the most constructive, I believe. So at any rate, I hope that leaves you a little bit of insight, gives you some foundation as to what the Tower of Babel was, what it's about, and we're going to see how ultimately this is, and all of this what we're talking about is tearing you or pointing you away from God. And this is what was going on with the Nephilim in terms of infiltrating the people of God and ultimately the Hebrews. So I wanted to lay this foundation for you because there's a lot more to come in the next broadcast. We're going to be breaking down Nimrod and the meaning of that, and I'm going to break down the architecture that was involved, some of the evidence that we see today, and just how big this Tower of Babel really was. It's going to blow you away. I promise you, it's going to blow you away. So I'd like to thank you as always for joining and hopping on board. I hope to see you the next time. Questions, comments, please email me at russackoutlook@gmail.com. I'll be happy to answer you any which way I can, and if I don't have the answer, I'll tell you, and I'll certainly continue the dialogue and the discussion. So I've enjoyed this. I thank you for your time, and I hope to see you on the flip side. And remember, as always, just my opinion.